Support Narativ's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative and check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and download.
People should remain calm. They should remain where they are, except if they are in southern Manhattan. If you're below Canal Street, you should walk out of southern Manhattan and walk north, as these people are doing right here.
That was the moment that defined how the world knew Rudy Giuliani up until very recently. A myth made in real time, beamed into the homes of millions of people around the world. And an enduring image, ultimately, one that really belied his true actions and intentions back then, and also his track record as a mayor in New York City, which some people credit as being pretty amazing, but others will disagree that he was that good a mayor. Now he's under investigation again, as you know, by the very prosecutor's office that he used to run, the Southern District of New York. He's no longer America's mayor. That's no longer his starring role. Now his role is Donald Trump's bagman or Donald Trump's errand boy running around the world doing all sorts of shady deals for the President of the United States. We've seen his handiwork in Ukraine, and I'm going to explain to you tonight how his work and Donald Trump are engaged in something similar but different in Libya. It involves Libya's massive oil supplies. It involves them manipulating our own foreign policy here in the United States to their own will, to their own, to their will, or maybe Putin's will, who knows. But in order to get that oil, that really rich oil, out of Ukraine. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live. We have a special report tonight and a special day because in just a few minutes from now, maybe 40 minutes from now, they're going to start marking up the impeachment resolutions, the articles of impeachment. Long time coming for many people I know who are fans of the show, and many of my friends in this weird social media world that we've created over the last 3 years, which has been, I always say this, the biggest crowdsourced investigation in history. Today's impeachment certainly is a credit to all the credible investigators at the FBI and everybody else, certainly these legislators in the House, but also a credit to every single person who spent the last 3 years researching endlessly every single piece of Donald Trump's life. And we all know each other as sort of hashtags and ats here, and we might not even know each other's faces. But it's a tribute to everybody that we got here today. So I want to congratulate all of you for this day. I'll get you to the hearing on time, I hope. Although this is a long show, it's kind of complicated. I'll do it as quickly as I can. But settle back, take some notes, tell me where I'm going off into weird tangents, and let's take a look at Black Cube. We begin in Saint-Jacques-Cap-Ferrat, a monument to excess situated halfway between Monaco and Nice on the French Riviera, and a magnet for celebrities and moneyed people of all types. In June 2016, even the somewhat jaded local media was curious about the wedding du jour. Here's the bride now, the 21-year-old Anastasia Fuchs, wearing a $5,000 dress, and that's her father by her side, Pavel Fuchs, the Ukrainian oligarch, who's said to be worth as much as $270 million. He's an ally of Vladimir Putin and also reputed to be a corporate raider. He's got into a lot of trouble. He's been barred from the US. He's facing fraud charges in Moscow. And of course, he's a friend of Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani. Absolutely no expense spared for a wedding spectacle which had everybody asking questions. You see, the bride was dating a nice Jewish boy from Ukraine. They were expected to get married. Then she abruptly decided to break up with him and marry her groom, and yet she wouldn't even show her groom's face on her Instagram account. Who is he? Masoud Abdel Hafiz. If you recognize the name, that's because his grandfather was Muammar Gaddafi's right-hand man, sort of the henchman for Gaddafi. They fled Libya to Egypt when Gaddafi died, and then Massoud and his brother Ahmed finally moved to London, where they set up shop and lived normal lives. Turns out Mr. Abdul Hafiz had come into a supply of Libyan oil, which needed distribution. Not just any Libyan oil, ISIS Libyan oil. And so it seems that Anastasia was married off as something of an insurance policy. Now, that music, Skyfall, is actually playing at the wedding. It's so remarkable because, in fact, this entire story is very much like a James Bond story. And that music, of course, from the latest James Bond movie, or one of them in any event. The reason I say it's like James Bond is because Pavel Fuchs really is I think he might actually be a real Secret Service agent for the Russians. He operates like one. Many people speculate he is. And certainly that's the way the Russians like to roll with their oligarchs. And the skepticism around this wedding not only involves the fact that he's a secret agent and his daughter is marrying a grandson of a Libyan henchman. It's also because the Fuchs family would not even mention the Abdulhafiz's name in any public statements. It would just come to our daughter's wedding, but we won't tell you who she's marrying. And then on top of that, there's this whole thing where she wouldn't show his face on Instagram, except for one picture where it's covered up. There's also this, this could be the reason why, because it turns out that the grandfather is on a UN sanctions list, a UN terror sanctions list, and there you see his name, Massoud Abdul Hafiz. That's the grandfather, that's not the guy that she married, colonel in the armed forces, commander. It also says he was part of military intelligence in Libya, which anyone who, it's got to say Russia to you. You got to yell Russia to you. And so it seems to bear certain credence that the Abdul Hafiz family was involved in some nefarious stuff, as the grandfather was, but maybe as the children are and the grandchildren are too. What makes it even more complicated is that, of course, Pavel Fuchs is really, really close to Donald Trump and to Rudy Giuliani, and particularly close. This is not just your average kind of, hey, I know that guy, or maybe I used to know that guy, but I don't know him now. I'm talking about real close. In fact, my findings are that Donald Trump, his associates, and his family have had business ties in some form or another with Pavel Fuchs for over a decade, dating back to 2004, in fact, which sort of places it around the time that those casinos went bankrupt. I can also tell you that Donald Trump's son, according to, this is a quote from Pavel Fuchs himself, he said, Donald Trump's son also wanted to enter the real estate market in Russia, and he flew to us for negotiations many times. In fact, it was so many times, because in 2008, Donald Trump Jr. visited Moscow 6 times in an 18-month period, starting in 2008. No one needs to go to Moscow that many times, in a lifetime probably, but in this particular case, for an American businessman, the son of an American businessman, what was he doing in Moscow? Yes, he said, we see a lot of money pouring in from Russia. But is that really a reason to go all the way there every couple of months? Or did he have other reasons? And the only other reasons people speculate could be that either he was getting sort of training, or he was maybe, had a girlfriend of some sort over there. That's also entirely possible too. Now, Fuchs has ties to the Solnitsvsky, I'm running that name, I'm sure, organized crime syndicate, and he's also friends with the ex-senator in Ukraine, Alexander Karavanasov, also probably running that name. But those two people are linked to organized crime. He's under criminal investigation in Russia, in Ukraine. He's barred from entering the United States and Mexico and Israel. And the reason he's currently not in Russia is because he was almost under arrest, but Vladimir Putin was able to save his arrest. But he did tell him it's maybe a good time for you to move permanently to Ukraine. There is more. I can go on forever here. Look, there's 2 slides here of 8 reasons, 8 ties that Donald Trump has to Pavel Fuchs. I'll point to the biggest ones. Number one, in 2006, Fuchs and Yeltsin's son-in-law, Valentin Yumashev, licensed the Trump brand for the first Moscow Trump Tower. And then, if you look down the second one here, Mukhtar Ablyazov, who is responsible for $1 billion embezzlement from a bank in Uzbekistan. That money also was invested, or some of that money was invested, in the Trump Soho Tower by Felix Sater. Guess who his business partner was? Pavel Fuchs. It goes on and on. On the second slide here, and I'll put these up somewhere for you guys to check out yourself. He did try to come and see the the inauguration. He attended the inauguration of Donald Trump in 2017. He paid $200,000, didn't get to go to the main event, so now he's suing over that. There is a terrific picture of Pavel Fuchs and Kevin McCarthy. I'm going to pull that up for you later in the show if I can find it, because it just tells you everything. And there's more. But you get my point. The two of them have a long history as business partnerships. I'll tell you that I have phoned around to ask a lot about Pavel Fuchs, and every time I call someone in the Ukraine, it's like their automatic response to me is, "Oh, there's no truth to the rumor. There's no truth to the rumor." And I was like, "What rumor? I haven't even asked you what I'm asking." The rumor about Pavel Fuchs. There's no truth to it. So you know that they've obviously been primed to tell me, or to tell whomever, that Pavel Fuchs is not a Russian agent, because that's what they all tell me. I don't know if that's true. Because you know what? These guys have another big interest, Pavel and Donald Trump, that they share with each other. And that is a big interest in Libyan oil. It's a deep financial well, I believe, for Pavel Fuchs, and it's also something that Donald Trump has spoken about repeatedly, about how much he would like to have all that Libyan oil, which he says is some of the finest in the world. Here he is in 2011. He did this interview with the Wall Street Journal, and he quite clearly says that the only thing he's interested in terms of Libya is not human rights, not getting rid of Gaddafi, none of those things. His only and singular focus, as it was with Iraq, as it was with Libya, is oil.
As far as Libya is concerned, I'd only be interested in Libya if we get the oil. Without the oil, I have no interest, and we shouldn't be there. As far as Libya is concerned,
you don't have to hear it again. You get the general point. So what do we have now? We have a situation where we've got Giuliani and Trump's really good friend, Pavel Fuchs, who has his daughter marrying a grandson of the Libyan leader, Muammar Gaddafi's henchman. And that's where we are at. We have no deal yet about oil, but we suspect there's a deal for oil. Why do we suspect there's a deal for an oil? Because it sort of happened in this way. It comes out of the Ukrainian media. There was a story that was planted, I believe, by the Russians, which explains exactly how Pavel Fuchs was able to get his hands on that oil through this marriage. And here's how the Ukrainian media at least tell the story. Muammar Gaddafi met his fate hiding in a sewer duct on the side of a Libyan highway. The tragic circumstances of his death are well known, but what isn't as well known is that his death left a power vacuum into which all sorts of bad players flowed. Some of Gaddafi's loyalists fled into exile, but they returned a few years later to get the oil. And on the ground, they formed an alliance with ISIS. They managed to capture 13 oil fields. Suddenly, the militias and ISIS were sitting on millions of barrels of black gold, and they had no way to get it to market. They needed someone with name recognition and connections. So this is where the story gets a little bit murky, a little bit hard to believe, because I can't really imagine that this is the sequence of events that led to this international deal. But let's say it is, and let's tell you the story anyhow. Abdullah Fiz was attending school in London. One of his classmates was Anastasia Fuchs. They were good friends. He told her about his problem, the fact that he had all this oil that he needed to get to market. She called her father, Pavel, and asked for a favor. Pavel obliged, and he met Masoud at a London hotel. And Masoud asked him for a couple of tankers, as one does when you're talking to a real estate mogul. Lucky for him, Pavel Fuchs came through. He was able to hatch a plan. In Libya, there was one guy, Khalifa Haftar, who basically controlled the access to the ports. Nothing left or arrived without his approval. Khalifa Haftar was sponsored by Vladimir Putin. Super convenient for Fuchs, because he knew Putin really well. And that is how Masoud Abdelhafid and his bride Anastasia Fuchs happened to get married in June 2016 over barrels of oil which funded ISIS. That incredibly fascinating, because this is a story that's been printed in the Ukrainian media as fact. However, when you really look at the details of this, you realize that it's not all there. You know, Lincoln's Bible and I always have this conversation about how do you know what's disinformation and what isn't disinformation. She always tells me that, you know something is that there's always a kernel of truth in any bit of disinformation. In other words, you're always getting some facts that are accurate within any disinformation, and then you get a lot of other stuff that is really meant to throw you off the trail. And in this case, there's a lot of interesting facts in this story about how this marriage happened and how the guerrillas were looking for somebody to help them export this oil, but there's no mention of the Russian government. And that to me is a huge hint that the Russians, in fact, planted this story, because it's the Russians who really are after this oil, and they're just throwing people off the scent by saying it started organically. It didn't start organically. In all likelihood, this is a plan by Putin to get the oil out of Libya. And it's a plan that ultimately involves the United States. It's a plan that ultimately involves Donald Trump. And it involves your vote, and it involves Americans' votes every time, and it involves today's impeachment process, because like Ukraine, Donald Trump is using the American foreign policy in order to get things for Vladimir Putin and to get things for the Russian mob, and probably to get himself something too out of all of that. And that requires a lot of adjustment, but it's not just Ukraine. It's also Libya. It's also likely Venezuela. It's also likely North Korea. There's a scheme, as has become the term of this entire scandal. There's a scheme for each one of Trump's incredibly poor foreign policy decisions, but also his policy priorities, which have all gotten him richer along the way. Now, I'm going to stop and tell you a little bit about ISIS in a different way. We all think about ISIS as sort of this, out of control, maybe terror group that is pretty much running around the world. I think I might be in the wrong place. Give me a second. Let me catch my breath here. Let me see where I'm at. You know what, while I do that, let me remind you of something. There's this, I'll get back to ISIS in a second. There was another time we heard about Muammar Gaddafi and Libya alongside the name Donald Trump. And you might remember this in 2010. So in 2010, Gaddafi comes to the United Nations for the first time. Everyone's a little freaked out that he's here, and what are we going to do with him? And then it turns out that he wants to pitch a ceremonial tent in the place that he's staying. So he proposes Central Park, and people are like, no, we don't think we want your ceremonial tent. Not in Central Park. Just go find somewhere else. So he goes everywhere, can't find anybody to help him pitch this tent or allow him to pitch his tent. He finally settles on, who else? Donald Trump. Believe it or not, Donald Trump's the guy that knows Muammar Gaddafi probably than anyone else, or knew Muammar Gaddafi better than anyone else.
American celebrities like Martha Stewart and Ralph Lauren live nearby. Now another big name, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, is making news here. Mr. Gaddafi pitched his tent on Donald Trump's property in Bedford and caused a stir. It was not a camping tent, but a ceremonial tent for receiving guests. American celebrities like Martha Stewart and Ralph Lauren.
All right, we're having fun tonight because there's lots of tape, there's lots of scripts. This is why it's a live taping. It's my excuse for doing the show live and then being able to edit it later on so you can all see it in the podcast. All right, so that's Muammar Gaddafi, Donald Trump in 2011, them sharing a tent pitching thing at his home at the Bedford Golf Course. Now, there was another time that that Donald Trump spoke about oil and Libyan oil in a very specific way. One of the most pivotal, important events of the entire 2016 Trump-Russia fold-out, the way they slowly rolled out their campaign, the way they slowly made a deal to inhabit this presidency of the United States. One of the most pivotal events, which I think was probably the most important, is when the deal was done. And I think that deal was done on April the 27th, 2016 at the Mayflower Hotel. That's when, remember there was a whole bunch of foreign dignitaries, including Sergei Kislyak, came to attend. And it's the first time that Donald Trump spoke about his foreign policy. The whole thing was sponsored by the Center of National Interest, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., but it's really a front for Russian government activity. And Dmitry Simes is the guy that's mentioned many times in the Mueller report as the person who sort of helped put that event together. At that event, Trump makes some really unusual but pro-Russian statements. And he lists 5 specific weaknesses around the world that he knows he's going to attack if he becomes president. And one of those 5 things that he attacks is Libyan oil. Listen to what he says about what he wants to do with the Libyan oil.
ISIS is making millions and millions of dollars a week selling Libya oil. And you know what? We don't blockade, we don't bomb, we don't do anything about it. It's almost as if our country doesn't even know what's happening, which could be a fact and could be true.
So as it turns out, our country didn't know what was happening. Only Donald Trump knew what was happening at the time. I searched and searched and searched, and really that's the only modern reference that I can find where there's any mention of Libyan oil being taken by ISIS or being sold by ISIS into the marketplace. In fact, there's one fact check which sort of backs up my thinking here that was published in various newspapers by factcheck.org, which it talks about what Trump had just said in the Mayflower just the night before, but then it says, an expert on Libya's oil operations told us there's no evidence the Islamic State is producing or selling oil out of that country. Isn't that interesting? How would Donald Trump be the only person in the world to know that Libyan oil was being sold by ISIS? It just makes no real sense. But yet he seems so adamant to tell people that that's the case back then. And it turns out that that is the truth. In 2017, we found out that there was oil being smuggled out of Libya and that it benefited ISIS. But that was much long after this 2016 June address. So I'm going to back up here and try reframe ISIS for you, because in the West, we're correct in thinking that ISIS is sort of this undisciplined, aggressive group of extremist people running around the world, beheading people, causing explosions, being incredibly terrorist-like organizations. But they're not really that. I mean, they are certainly terrorists. I'm not suggesting that they're not. I would not say that. But I will say that they're also much more frightening than just terrorists. They're much more frightening than just your Al-Qaeda kind of terrorists that pop up from place to place and do a terror attack. Because they're in fact a highly organized and extremely well-funded, extremely profitable proxy army. And they run as a proxy army on behalf of various clients, not just one state, but particularly Russia and particularly Turkey. And that is basically how we got to everything in the Middle East and how we got to the situation where we are today, where ISIS is presumed to be an enemy of Russia and of the United States. But in reality, it's a proxy army for Russia. Take a look at this. Or take a look at this. ISIS is thought of, in the West at least, as a lawless terror organization intent on destroying the United States and wanting to turn parts of the Middle East into a Sharia law ideological fortress. But in reality, it's nothing like that. It's probably better described as an outlaw transnational crime syndicate. Most of its profits come from smuggling oil, people, human trafficking, and plundering artifacts. It has clients all over the world, but most of them are nation states like Russia and Turkey who are trying to push an agenda using ISIS as a proxy power. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that ISIS was founded by Russia in some ways. Many of its fighters come from Chechen rebels. In fact, Russia uses ISIS as a satellite proxy army to fight wars in the Middle East. But mostly, it's about the oil, whether it's Libya, Syria, or Iraq, where ISIS has had strongholds. It's always been about exporting smuggled oil, billions of dollars of it, to the European and global marketplace. Over the years, there's been an international shell game when one country blames another country for smuggling the oil out of Syria, for example, as Russia did about Turkey a few years ago. The truth is, Russia has such a hold over Syria and over Libya, only it can say where the oil goes. Assad was revealed to have gotten his oil from ISIS under Russian auspices, and in Libya, much of the oil is under the control of Khalifa Haftar, also supported by Putin. In 2017, Italian prosecutors said they had cracked what they called an oil smuggling ring that was netting $1 million a day. The syndicate illegally exported 30 shipments of oil between June 2015 and June 2016. And this is the way it worked. So oil was smuggled out of Libya on small vessels, transferred to oil tankers out in the open seas. It was then shipped to Malta, where it was relabeled as coming from Saudi Arabia and then exported to the world. This syndicate involved the Sicilian La Cosa Nostra, and Italian prosecutors were convinced that part of the organization's profits were landing up with ISIS. Hi. That's where we first found out that ISIS was involved in benefiting from this smuggled oil coming out of Libya. a lot longer, a year or so after Donald Trump proclaimed it as fact before the Mayflower crowd when he was making that first foreign policy address. Now, I want to put all these things that I've been talking about in context for you, because we've spoken about first about a wedding that took place in June 2016. Let me throw this up here and see, as cheesy as this might look, I can walk you through this thing right over here. That's the article where they explain Donald Trump making that address in April 2016, and they talk about there being no real facts about it. Next to it in June 2016, which is right over here, I guess, is the wedding. That's when the wedding happens in June 2016. Above it is an article explaining how ISIS was making $1 million a day between June 2015 and June 2016. By smuggling that oil. But that article is actually dated August 2017, which is also when the kingpin, who was the smuggling kingpin out of Libya, was arrested. So that story really broke in August 2017, even though the investigation ended in June 2016 at around the same time that this wedding took place between the daughter of Pavel Fuchs and Masoud Abdul Hafiz. And what's also particularly interesting for me there is that was just a month or two after Donald Trump made his address where he said that Libyan oil was going to be such a priority and getting it out of the hands of ISIS. So you certainly see a sequence of events that may or may not be tied. You know, it's so hard at these things to be able to predict exactly, you know, where the money's flowing, how it's flowing. We do know that around that same time, we're talking about August 2017, we know that Rudy Giuliani got a $500,000 check from Pavel Fuchs in around June or August 2017. So I know that because his company, Giuliani and Associates, and also himself, you're in there directly, but he's got his whole party. If you see in that June, August 2017 section over there at the very top, is a photo of his Giuliani and Associates visiting Kharkiv, starting their consulting services. And I believe that's where he got his $500,000 from Pavel Fuchs. And then below that, he's visiting Kiev, where he's talking about how President Trump wants to send a message to all people in Kyiv saying, we'll make Ukraine great again. All right, so there's a lot to take in there, but there is money flowing between Rudy Giuliani and Pavel Fuchs. There is something happening with the wedding, which doesn't look like a real wedding. It looks like a wedding made out of business, and that business is the smuggling of oil. There's a clear interest on behalf of the President of the United States in keeping that oil, on getting that oil. And so we're starting to see a framework, perhaps, of what could be one of these quid pro quo kind of schemes. But it's not as cleanly as we all like to think about it. You know, we all like to think about it. I give you one thing, you give me something in exchange. What they like to do, it seems, look, judging by what they did in Ukraine, what they've done here, is there is something happening over here, and I'm just doing something over here that makes this thing easier. And in this case, it's Khalifa Haftar. Khalifa Haftar is the warlord who has taken over a huge piece of the southern part of Libya. Because there's really two sort of governments in Libya. There's the Western-backed United Nations government in Libya, and then there's the Russian-backed warlord guy named Khalifa Haftar. Al Jazeera did a great job of explaining this, so let them explain to you exactly how these two governments break down, and then I'll explain to you where the quid pro quo happens between Trump and Putin in order to get that Libyan oil into Russian hands.
While the United Nations backs the internationally recognized government in Tripoli, in the eastern city of Al-Baida, there is a parallel government affiliated with the Tobruk-based parliament and the warlord Khalifa Haftar, and it's backed by Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Egypt. Both governments have their own central banks. The central bank in Al-Baida city has sold bonds worth more than $23 billion to fund its wage bill. While Britain prints out money for Tripoli, Russia has printed 10 billion dinars for the parallel administration in the east. Libya is a wealthy nation. Its $80 billion in oil revenues and foreign reserves are managed by Tripoli. But Haftar has seized oil fields in the east and the south of the country.
I me's a significant amount of money. It's also some of the best, purest oil in the world. It's the cheapest to produce. $80 billion is a lot of money. And Russia is desperately interested in controlling all of that, as they are interested in controlling the oil in Iraq, as they're interested in controlling the oil in Syria. And in fact, they've been able to do this during the Donald Trump presidency. They've been able to consolidate all this oil. They basically have the Syrian oil, even though we're looking after it, whatever that means. They have a big protest building in Iraq so they can get that oil. But even still, they've had a huge investment of oil infrastructure and refineries and things in Iraq. And so throughout these 3 years, while all of us have been, blindly or chaotically wandering through the crisis and the chaos created by Donald Trump, Putin has been getting away with pillaging the entire region and basically stealing all the oil. And we could see it in Syria. We saw it in Syria recently when they suddenly had to withdraw the troops so Turkey could come in and do what? Basically, they're trying to get a hold of all those resources. Today, we found out that Turkey may invade Libya in order to clear up the mess over there. The mess is created by Putin. The mess is created by ISIS, which he funds. And so you can see that this is a mess created by Putin. Then he comes in, he cleans it up. And well, you see, he's the hero of all things. And we know this because out of the blue, in I think April this year, Trump decided that he was switching sides. And this wasn't big news because there's so much else going on, but he decides he switched his sides. So up until now, the United States government has been fully supportive of the United Nations-backed government in Tripoli, which is the one that sort of the world respects. However, there is, as they mentioned over there, a different government that's controlled by Khalifa Haftar, that's backed by Russia, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, probably Israel, as we start to know these alliances, probably Turkey, as we know these alliances. And suddenly, out of the blue, Trump decides he's switching sides. He's going to endorse Khalifa Haftar on his own. Just decides he was going to do it. No questions asked. Not having to feel responsible for anybody else. It says here, President Trump on Friday abruptly reversed American policy towards Libya, issuing a statement publicly endorsing an aspiring strongman in the battle to depose the United Nations-backed government. It also says here, Secretary of State Pompeo said in a statement a few days after Mr. Haftar's militia began its attack that the administration at the highest levels had made clear that we oppose the military offensive. So he was going against what Pompeo was saying. Trump just decided out of the blue that he's going to back the Libyan strongman, Khalifa Haftar, and basically try to get him to install his same self as the leader of Libya and kick out the United Nations government over there. Now, I mean, I don't think Donald Trump has a particular interest in Libya other than he wants the oil. He said as much, like he's not there for any other particular reasons. In the midst of everything that he's been facing, this wouldn't be a priority. The only reason this would be a priority is if he was getting something out of it, right? If either his buddy, Putin, who he must be partners with, he's getting something out of it, or he's getting something out of it, or he wouldn't bother. Why would you suddenly switch sides? Why would you suddenly go from the United Nations-backed governments to a warlord? It makes no sense. So my feeling is, and it's a theory that I think needs investigation. I think that there's enough circumstances here, enough pattern. We talk about fact patterns a lot these days, and for good reason. I think there's a real fact pattern here, which suggests that Trump has made a lot of money off the sale of Libyan oil. Now, that same money has gone to fund ISIS. And, it boggles my mind that the President of the United States can have anything to do with funding ISIS, anything at all to do with funding ISIS, when so many brave American soldiers have died fighting ISIS. That the war on terror, which has captured our imagination for the last 20, 30 years, has caused so much death and destruction. How an American president can have anything to do with that is beyond my scope of comprehension. It drives me so nuts. But it appears that there's something here, or he wouldn't have flipped sides like that. He wouldn't have suddenly endorsed Khalifa Haftar. He would have had to do it for a good reason. And there's more to the story. I also couldn't find confirmation of this. I found only one spot, that says that Haftar has actually been issued an arrest warrant because of his activities for war crimes, really, essentially. And this I could only find in a South African website, but I couldn't find it reprinted anywhere else. So if anyone can find that, that would be interesting to see if there's an American arrest warrant. And if there's an American arrest warrant for his war crimes, what about Putin, who sponsors him? What about Donald Trump, who might be selling the oil in order to benefit from there? And so I think we have the makings of a scheme, a second scheme. We had Ukraine scheme, now here's Libya scheme. Lucky all of us. How many more do we have to give up, and how much more do we have to give up? And this scheme looks a little like this. Trump provides political cover by making these big shifts in who American supports in Libya. Putin uses that opportunity, along probably with Erdogan or anybody else, to consolidate things on the ground militarily, and then he seizes those resources, which is seizing that oil. And then there's all sorts of corrupt self-dealing that goes on after that, while they install a puppet regime like the Haftar regime. And in the background, pulling the money chains is Rudy Giuliani. He's getting money from Pavel Fuchs, perhaps. Maybe that $500,000 was for something else. Maybe it was for something other crazy thing. But we know that Fuchs is interested in that oil because he's been the guy moving it around. And there's Donald Trump tied to Khalifa Haftar. But in the middle, Vladimir Putin is the guy calling all the shots, getting all the benefits, scoring all the money, getting all the oil, as any organized mafia boss would do. And that's sort of where I'm at. That's the end of the investigation as far as we know it today. But I think that I think there's a body of evidence here to suggest that something really weird has gone on. There's no ways Donald Trump would have suddenly shifted his allegiance like that. Pavel Fuchs, on the one hand, is not that thrilled about his daughter having married Masoud Abdul Hafiz. And in fact, that marriage broke up. I'm told that within a year it did break up, and I'm not sure what the circumstances behind that were. But, they were so embarrassed about that wedding, even though it was so flashy, that it's kind of hard to imagine why they went ahead with it, unless there was a business interest there involved. We know Putin is so aggressively working in the Middle East, trying to get all this oil, trying to get all these resources. How many times has this been going on in the 3 years? And every time Donald Trump has been, gaslighting the nation or scandalizing the nation day after day after day, while all this kind of behind the scenes stuff has been going on, where Russia takes over the oil in Iraq or Libya or Syria, or Turkey suddenly decides it wants to invade party X, Y, or Z, or in Saudi Arabia, where we know there's been a nuclear scandal, or in Venezuela, where there's been a gas scandal, oil scandal again. I mean, it's beginning to look like not like it's a scheme. It looks like there are schemes, and there are so many schemes that whatever happens tonight, and it's 7 p.m. now, so I'm going to switch off because I want you guys to be able to watch the articles of impeachment. But keep in mind that we're not just talking about one thing. We're not just talking about Ukraine, and we're not even just talking about Ukraine and Mueller. We're probably talking about Ukraine, Mueller, plus. Thanks very much for watching. Enjoy watching the articles of impeachment. I actually am super excited that this is happening. I hope everybody really starts focusing on these senators, not in a vindictive, attacking kind of way. I think we got to work on their conscience. There's 22 of them that are up for re-election. Let's find out who they are, and let's see if we can talk them into doing the right thing for history and keep exposing all this incredible corruption. Because, the oil in Libya belongs to the people of Libya. It doesn't belong to Russia, and it doesn't belong to Khalifa Haftar, and it certainly doesn't belong to Donald Trump. And that's why America doesn't do this. We don't rape and pillage and plunder, and that's why we're looked up to in the world. I'd rather be that nation than be the other nation. Patreon.com/narrative. It's where you can donate and support Narrative at $5 a month or more. Patreon.com/narrative. Really need your support to keep us going. And otherwise, have a good night. Happy impeachment articles marking up night. And we'll see you again soon on Narrative. Support Narrative's independent journalism at patreon.com/narrative. And check out our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe and download. Support Narrative's independent